coming up today. President Park Geun-hye flies to Beijing this week for a war anniversary event and talks with China's leaders about economic cooperation and ways to denuclearize North Korea. Korea's rival parties condemn a Japanese newspaper for likening President Park to a Korean empress who was assassinated by Japanese agents over a century ago. Plus, US Secretary of State John Kerry calls South Korea a superb partner ahead of talks with Seoul's Foreign Minister Yun Byung-se in Alaska. Stay tuned for these stories and more. Hello and welcome. It's 6 a.m. on Tuesday, September 1st here in Seoul. I'm Mark Broome and you're tuned in to our early morning edition of Arirang News. Our top story this morning, President Park Geun-hye heads to China on Wednesday for a packed trip aimed at remembering the past, but also building for the future. As well as attending China's World War II victory celebrations, President Park will discuss bilateral economic cooperation and North Korea with Chinese President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Keqiang. Chae-sun starts us off.
South Korea's presidential office says it anticipates China's contributions to restoring peace and stability on the Korean peninsula. President Park is scheduled for summit talks with President Xi Jinping Wednesday. She's expected to call on China to actively persuade North Korea to change course towards a thaw in cross-border ties. The summit could also generate momentum for a restart to the multilateral six-party negotiations to curb North Korea's nuclear program, as both Park and Xi are scheduled to meet U.S. President Barack Obama in the coming weeks. The South Korean president, who will be the only leader of a U.S. allied nation to attend the war victory events on September 3rd, including a Chinese military parade, is seeking to take the lead in the cooperative framework between its key ally Washington and regional partner Beijing. Ahead of her meeting with President Obama in October, President Park will likely push for a three-way summit with China and Japan, which could also pave the way for a one-on-one meeting with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. The U.S. considers cooperation with Korea and Japan the centerpiece of its so-called pivot to Asia policy and wants Seoul and Tokyo to seek ways to improve relations strained by historical differences. On economic cooperation with Beijing, President Park will discuss further expanding mutual economic benefits by way of a free trade deal awaiting ratification on both sides with Chinese Premier Li Keqiang. President Park will also be accompanied by the largest ever business delegation on a trip, raising hopes for more future investments between Korea and China. 최유선, 아리랑 뉴스.
Korea's rival parties have denounced Japan's Sankei Shimbun newspaper for likening President Park Geun-hye to Empress Myeong-song, who was assassinated by Japanese agents in 1895. The ruling Saenuri party said the newspaper's absurd remarks were a shameful portrait of Japan's right-wing extremism, which has no place in the minds of the country's conscientious public and the rest of the international community. It added that Japan must apologize for its wartime atrocities. The main opposition, NPAD, also criticized the newspaper, saying it was enraged by the outrageous remarks from Japan's extreme right-wingers who distort history. It urged the Sankei Shimbun to delete the article from the newspaper. The newspaper published an article on Monday in which it said President Park's decision to attend China's military parade this week was an act of toadyism, comparing her with Empress Myeong-song. It then claimed Korea was trying to double deal with the US and China. US Secretary of State John Kerry has heaped praise on South Korea, saying the country is a superb partner. The top US diplomat made the remark ahead of one-on-one talks with South Korea's Foreign Minister Yun Byung-se on the sidelines of the Conference on Global Leadership in the Arctic being held in Alaska. Their talks are largely centered around the security conditions on the Korean Peninsula following the recent deal between the two Koreas. They'll also be discussing President Park Geun-hye's scheduled visit to Washington in October, as well as a number of other pending issues related to their alliance. Prior to the meeting with Yoon, Kerry also hailed South Korea's commitment to tackle climate change. In a little under a week from now, representatives from the two Koreas will attempt to hammer out the details of planned reunions for war-separated families. This follows the landmark inter-Korean agreement reached last week. Seoul will also be pressing hard for reunions to be held on a regular basis. Kim Hyun-bin reports.
South Korean Red Cross officials will meet with their counterparts from the north next Monday for working-level talks at the truce village of Panmunjom to discuss reunions of separated families from the Korean War. The ministry says it plans to hold a reunion as soon as possible near the holiday Chuseok beginning September 27th. Unification Ministry spokesman Park Geun-hye said on Monday that the two sides will finalize details for reunion and waits to hold the event on a regular basis.
The main agenda will center on the preparations for the upcoming event, but ways to regularize the family reunions will also be dealt with.
Many experts say that Seoul must hold the reunions before October 10th, the 70th anniversary of the founding of North Korea's Workers' Party, because of a possible provocation from the north, including an intercontinental ballistic missile launch that will once again heighten tensions on the Korean Peninsula. Time is running out for many of the surviving family members, with most over the age of 70. As of the end of 2014, roughly 130,000 South Koreans had applied to meet their family members north of the border. However, a little more than 68,000 remain living today. Since 2000, 19 rounds of reunions for separated families have been held, with the last occurring in February of 2014. Kim Hyun-bin, Arirang News.
The South Korea-US alliance is at the core of peace in Northeast Asia and the Korean Peninsula. That's according to South Korean Prime Minister Hwang Kyo-an and Washington Governor Jay Inslee, who held talks in Seoul on Monday. They discussed last week's landmark inter-Korean deal to defuse tensions on the Korean Peninsula following the recent exchange of artillery fire and those landmine explosions that severely wounded 2 South Korean soldiers. Prime Minister Hwang said the governor's visit would enhance trade between the western US state and Korea. A former US ambassador to South Korea has hailed the recent landmark deal struck by the two Koreas. In a published letter to the editor of the New York Times, Donald Gregg said hardliners in the US who have been critical of the agreement should remember that it was forged by South and North Koreans and is only the two Koreas that can reunite their long-divided country. Gregg, who was the US envoy to Seoul from 1989 to 1993, said the deal demonstrated that both Koreas have a stake in improving their long-frozen relations. South Korea's Vice Defense Minister says that despite the recent inter-Korean deal, North Korea could launch a military provocation to mark the 70th anniversary of its establishment of its ruling Workers' Party on October 10th. Baek Seung-ju made the remarks on Monday during an interview with Japan-based Kyodo news agency. He said the possibility of a strategic provocation by the North, such as a test firing of a long-range ballistic missile or conducting a nuclear test, has actually grown since the two Koreas reached the landmark agreement last month. He noted that many watchers believe the North lost face in reaching that agreement. The minister added that in order for South Korea and Japan to strengthen military and security cooperation, the two countries must first secure political trust. Now, August came and went at Korea's National Assembly without much getting done at all. The biggest obstacle to progress was a key budget issue, and that's a problem that will probably continue to cause friction down the line as well. Park Ji-won has the details.
Lawmakers made very little progress as the August extraordinary session closed out on Monday. Since convening on August 7th, Parliament has passed less than a dozen bills for the least productive monthly session so far this year. Various legislation got backed up as the two main rival parties clashed over a multi-million-dollar classified budget item. It's a key issue that emerged during talks at the Assembly's Budget Committee meeting last week. Main opposition New Politics Alliance for Democracy lawmakers are demanding full disclosure of a so-called special activities budget.
The public needs to know how their taxes have been spent. Money allocated under the item of special activities came from people's pockets. We shouldn't let our taxpayers' money get drained any longer.
But the ruling Saenuri party is rejecting the idea, claiming the over $740 million annual budget is used to fund the nation's classified intelligence activities.
It's a totally incomprehensible act by the opposition party to stand in the way of a vote on the Supreme Court Justice nominee and other motions, which face deadlines this Monday, using the totally unrelated issue of the budget item as an excuse.
With the two parties at odds, the final full assembly of the August session was called off, also leaving the government's budget settlement for last year unsettled, among other urgent votes. A closed-door meeting was held Monday afternoon in an attempt to resolve the issue and to reschedule the full assembly, but that also fell through. Due to the standoff, a substantial setback is expected for the National Assembly's 100-day regular session, which will begin on Tuesday. Park Ji-won, Arirang News.
Korea's finance chief is urging a tripartite committee of government, labour and management to reach a compromise on labour market reforms in the next couple of weeks. Choi Kyung-hwan says an agreement is critical to earmark funds for those affected by an overhaul in the labour rules. The government and management representatives are set to soon resume talks with the Federation of Korean Trade Unions, the nation's largest trade union. Korea's 5 major business lobby groups also call for labour reforms to spark job creation. The group, including the Federation of Korean Industries and Korea Employers Federation, have voiced difficulties in increasing investment and employment due to the rigid labour market. August ended up going down as one of the worst months in a while for investors, especially here in Asia, following remarks by a top Federal Reserve official that the Fed might lift off on rates in the imminent future. Asian equities experienced their worst monthly decline in more than 3 years. Song Ji-son reports.
The U.S. Federal Reserve has left the door cracked on the likelihood of a September rate hike happening sooner than some investors expect. Speaking at a conference in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, Fed Vice Chairman Stanley Fischer said recent volatility in global markets could ease and possibly pave the way for a rate hike. Prospects of higher interest rates and returns in the United States combined with China's slowdown have pushed investors to liquidify riskier assets. Beijing's unexpected currency devaluation earlier this month has dented confidence in the government and added to fears that the economy may be at risk of slowing more abruptly than earlier expected. Registering losses for a third consecutive month, the Shanghai Composite Index has now shed nearly 40% since mid-June. Stocks in Hong Kong also lost more than 10% in August, while Tokyo saw its worst drop since 2012. Seoul stocks closed relatively untouched Monday, with the benchmark Kospi inching up. However, the Korean won weakened from last week's close to drop below the 1181 mark. But emerging countries are seeing greater losses, with currencies in Indonesia and India losing 3% this month, and the Singapore dollar seeing its biggest monthly decline in 3 years. Experts say jitters over emerging currencies are likely to remain, with investors still doubting China's ability to support the economy. Song Ji-son, Arirang News.
Now, for the first time ever, Korea's outbound shipments to China have accounted for more than 10% of China's import market over a 6-month period. This comes despite falling Chinese imports. Kwon So-ah has the details.
The proportion of Korean imports in China in the first half of the year has risen by 1 percentage point from the same period last year to 10.7%, reaching a double-digit figure for the first time ever. The proportion has been on a steady rise and is also widening its gap on Japanese imports in China since Korea supplanted Japan at the #1 spot in 2013. This is good news as Korea's exports in general haven't been doing well so far this year due to weak global demand, with outbound shipments to China being no exception. Exports to China fell more than 7% in the first half of this year, but considering China imported more than 19% less on-year during the same period, it may not seem too bad for Korea.
Although China has shifted its economic policy from an export-focused growth strategy to one focusing on the domestic market, Korean products seem to be maintaining high competitiveness compared to other countries.
An example of that competitiveness can be seen in Korea's top export to China. Memory semiconductors saw an increase by almost 17% in the January to June period from last year. The consumption market is also on the rise, with Hallyu, or the Korean wave, expanding to include Korean cosmetics, baby and hygiene products. But some experts attribute the rise in Korea's market share of Chinese imports to the deteriorating relations between China and Japan in recent years, adding that the risks of continuous slowing demand will not abate in the short term. Kwon So-ah, Arirang News.
Well, that's all we have for now. I'm Mark Broome. Have a great day, and thank you, as always, for tuning in. And we do hope to see you at the same time tomorrow. Until then, goodbye.